Greetings, I'm Matt Asher, and you found The Filter on YKYZ. My guest today is Vin Armani. I first heard Vin on the Free Man Beyond the Wall podcast, so shout out to Pete Quinones. Vin is a philosopher, serial tech entrepreneur, and crypto savage. He is the founder and chief technical officer of Cointext.io, an SMS-based cryptocurrency wallet available in over 40 countries. In addition to being a software developer, author, and speaker, Vin has made his living as a TV star, film producer, art galleryist, pirate radio station operator, DJ, and motorcycle courier. He studied philosophy at Howard University. Vin, welcome to The Filter.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Matt.
It's great to have you here. I want to start with something you said in an interview a couple years ago. You were discussing the patriarchal and matriarchal cycles with Chris DeRose, and you said that while we have a good idea of what patriarchal tyranny looks like, you said, we don't know what the devouring mother looks like yet, but you suspected we were going to find out. So I want to explore that idea of the devouring mother or the matriarchal tyranny. But before we go too deep into that, can you give an overview of the idea of what you mean by patriarchal and matriarchal cycles and their history?
Yeah, they're definitely loaded terms politically when we start to get into matriarchy and patriarchy. I'm using them, I think, as in a more holistic way when I'm using the terms as a simple catch-all for several different concepts. But at the crux of it is this. Human beings, as we move through the world and organize ourselves and each other, both so individually as we organize our consciousness and as groups when we organize consciousness together, there are two fundamental patterns that we tend to take. And this is what I'm referring to as patriarchal and matriarchal. Now, to be a little more woo-woo, we might call these energies. So as we talk, I might use this term energy. I'm not saying this in some like pull out the crystals and do all of that. Really what we're talking about is patterns or frequencies. So when we say frequency, when we're discussing energies, for instance, we're talking about a microwave energy. We're going to discuss cycles, frequencies, patterns. So energy is moving in a pattern throughout the universe, and it's these patterns that we recognize. So when we're talking about anything from electromagnetic energy, microwave energy, radio wave energy, it doesn't matter. These are all going to be in frequencies and patterns. And so the two fundamental patterns that human beings embrace are the patriarchal and the matriarchal. And this is basically planned and emergent.
So just to be clear here, these are not necessarily male and female, but they're connected?
Yes. So the reason why they're associated with male and female is because we have a biological dimorphism. And I don't know whether it is causation that our dimorphism caused us to behave in these two sort of archetypal and different ways. I think that there's an interplay between the way that we behave and the dimorphism. What I mean by dimorphism is human males and human females are physically different from each other in a lot of very important ways. And those physical differences play out in terms of the roles that our ancient ancestors played. And so that can get us right into what are these two roles, the matriarchy and patriarchy. Easiest example would be hunter-gatherer. Right? So we would tend to associate the hunting with the male, the gathering with the female. There's a lot of reasons why that would tend to emerge. That doesn't mean that females didn't hunt. That doesn't mean that males didn't gather. But you had a situation where an adult female would either be pregnant or caring for children for much of her life. This really precludes her from going out on very strenuous hunts. Also, she's a lot less expendable than a male. And so in the hunting or fighting, you end up with a hierarchical structure. So you see this whether it's in a hunting party, whether it's in war, you look at the military structure, that evolved because it works. And fundamentally what it does is it's a way of maximizing communication and movement from one individual down to, could be tens or hundreds of thousands. So the General decides what he wants the army to do. He tells his lieutenants. The lieutenants tell the sergeants tell their squads, and quickly you're all able to move. And you get a great deal of specialization in this, to where in the patriarchal model, which we see in things like corporations, which we see in governments, you get something that looks like a single organism moving forward, that we would say the federal government or Apple, right? We refer to these as single entities, although there's no there. It's a bunch of people, but they're moving according to a vision that's dictated from on high, let's say. And this is the patriarchy. And I think that in our society, we are very familiar with this idea of the patriarchy because for the past 10,000 years, this has been fundamentally the ruling energy. Now, before that 10,000 years, we see a lot more, for instance, people will be like, oh, matriarchal societies, there was goddess worship and all of this. Well, what does the female side of that look like? What sorts of behavior does that engender? What is the job of the female? So they're going to do some gathering in the general area. They're going to do some basic gardening and agriculture. They're going to do some crafting of tools. They're going to do food preparation, and they're going to do childcare. And within that model, as opposed to being a specialist where it's like, okay, you're an archer, that's all you do, or you're super fast, so you're going to run down this gazelle, and then we're all going to come and come after it. Instead, what you need is a great group of generalists. You want every single woman to be able to have all of the skills necessary to, for instance, take care of a child. Because it's going to take a village to raise a child, right? You never know. It may be your child today may be with an auntie, or it may be with grandma. And the idea is that the wisdom of our tribal ancestors was very much passed down through, especially the grandmothers, who had the general knowledge. This is everything from medicine to what to gather, food preparation, how do you build a thatch hut, how do you make clothing, all of these things. A young woman would be expected to know all of those things. And so what you get is, instead of centralized and specialized, you get decentralized and generalized. And so this has not been a dominant energy for a very long time in our species.
Just to jump in, I was actually doing a little bit of looking at that. It seems like perhaps there's some evidence that this was a way of structuring society, perhaps in Minoan Crete or other places. Have you looked into that at all?
I mean, it's not like it vanished, right? I think that these are ways that society is structured constantly. So, I mean, you have this within families, for instance. I think the most basic organizational unit is fundamentally, and we acknowledge this, even in the quote-unquote patriarchy, even in the most patriarchal societies, you go to some place where the women have to cover up. But you get into a home, for instance, in Iran. I was in a long-term relationship with a Persian woman whose family escaped from Iran during the revolution. And it's very patriarchal outside of the home. But when you get inside of the home, it is very clear that the women are the ones running the show. They have every right culturally to basically dominate the men within the home and tell them how things are going to go. And that's an arrangement that's made. And so there has never been a time in our existence when both the patriarchal mode of organization and the matriarchal mode of organization did not exist. In the very early days, there was a very good, and certainly still in indigenous cultures, the few that are left, you get this beautiful mix of the two and a balance between the two, and those are very sustainable societies.
Then I guess leading that up to, where we're at now, and the kind of organization that we have, you mentioned, it not being sustainable. Are we looking at a shift here? Is this the moment when the devouring mother takes over, when this pendulum shifts the other way?
Well, what I mean by not sustainable is that these two energies are always wanting to complement each other. You can never go too far in one direction without swinging violently back in the other direction to get some balance. When there is balance between the two, you don't see wild shifts in the culture. In other words, the culture of your ancestors living 3,000 years ago looks very much like the culture that you have at the time. And this is true of indigenous cultures where they're basically, since time immemorial, they would say, we've been behaving in this way. They don't have things like history books or anything like that. Their history is, maybe it includes some great chiefs who did a few interesting things. Maybe it includes some apocryphal stories or mythology that helps to tell some story about how they wound up where they were. But they don't have the sorts of history that we have, where it's like, this on this date, this happened, and this person did this, and then it led to this, and then it led to this. That's when you're dealing with a culture in flux that's trying to find that sustainable level. What I mean by unsustainable is that we are constantly on the move as a culture, and even more so now. And the power of the state, so let's say violent political power, has been fundamentally patriarchal until, I would say, the last 5 years. And what has made the shift has been a flattening of hierarchies, basically due to global communication and particularly social media, and the impact that social media has had. Also, its interaction with the state. And in the discussion with Krista Rose, the example that I brought up of what had really told me that the Devouring Mother was on the move was hashtag movements like the Me Too movement, which were, through social media hashtags, taking down some of the most powerful people in the world, and powerful men who were a huge part of the patriarchy in the corporate and in the governmental spheres. And when I saw that, I said, oh, the power is beginning to shift. We've had a tyrant, and of course the answer to the tyrant is the tyrannical mother, the devouring mother of the matriarchy. It's not going to be healthy. And I think that now, by embracing the tyrant, for better or worse, we have fully unlocked the fury of the devouring mother, and that's exactly what I think that we're experiencing in this current moment of lockdowns globally.
Right, and I do want to get into that quite a bit, but before we do, I want to touch more on what you said about the hashtag thing, and that looks like a kind of a bottom up decentralized movement that came to take down people who were in power. Make the case to me, though, because just looking at it on its face, even though, Me Too obviously was about women who had been mistreated, but beyond that, it seems like just the fact that it was a decentralized movement, how does that play into the matriarchal thing? Because you could also see, an uprising of, I guess, the peasants with pitchforks, and that being kind of a male energy too. So how does that fit together?
So again, let's not get distracted in terms of male or female. It's not fundamentally important that Me Too was women against men. I think that what is important about it was that within that movement, and just as a signal, right? Just as a sort of a resonance of energy. Again, we're talking about patterns, recognizing patterns. It was interesting that so much of the narrative around the Me Too movement was that they were taking down the patriarchy. But what's fundamentally more important to look at as we look deeper in this discussion, let's definitely not get caught up on the male-female thing. Those are interesting signals, but they're not what's fundamentally important. So the organizational structure of the patriarchy is a pyramid. This is why we have seen this symbol throughout the last 10,000 years utilized both in practice, literally in the deserts of Egypt, but also esoterically, like as a symbol on the back of the $1 bill. The pyramid with one individual at the top, this is the sovereign, who then, as we talked about, is able to spread knowledge down to the bottom. So the organization starts at the top, that all-seeing eye on the capstone of the pyramid on the back of the $1 bill. This is the power of the hierarchy, which we're also referring to as the patriarchy. Whereas the organizational structure of the matriarchy is a network. It's flat. So it wasn't that Me Too was a bottom up. There's no up there. There's a single level. It's flat. It's a network. And that's how the internet operates. That's how an epidemic moves. That's how a virus moves. That's how Bitcoin transactions move. Basically, this is how knowledge is diffused. This is how new words come into being. So language, spoken language, this is a matriarchal structure. Why is the word cat called cat? I mean, we could take it back in the etymology, right? Why is that little furry creature? Why do we call that cat in English? We can take the etymology back, but we can't answer why this particular mouth noise. Who is the person that said, see that furry creature over there? You're going to use this mouth noise. And then why would it change over time? But if we look at how the language moved and we were to lay it out on a graph, it looks like a virus. It looks like the propagation of a hashtag. It looks like data moving through a decentralized network.
So this is almost like the matriarchal organization is almost like a mimetic organization. It's a spread through culture and through language, which I think is very important in understanding the moment and the way in which there seem to be ongoing wars, much more about ideas than about the language that we use. And I suppose this ties into the fact that, that historically anyway, and I'm sure to this day, language development is controlled by maternal forces by and large. And we know from studies that kids, as they grow up, they pattern their speaking after the mother and not the father. Does that fit in with what you're saying?
It does, but there's definitely a correlation between the male and female dimorphism, both physically and culturally, and the impact that a mother as versus a father, or the female side of the family as versus the male side of the family, has on a child. However, it's difficult to say whether or not it was the physical dimorphism that just made it so that men were participating in these necessary activities because they were better at them, because they had more upper body strength, they were larger, faster, whatever it was, not pregnant, right? It just so happens that the mother is spending the most time with the child, right? The child has been hearing the mother's voice since literally in the womb. And there is that tight correlation and that tight connection as well. So clearly, I mean, it seems self-evident that that would be the case, but I don't think that that negates your point. The point that the structures have evolved, the cultural structures, the mimetic structures, the way that our species has organized itself through natural selection has evolved so that the landscape in which women are operating is a much more network-based. Even just talking in a sort of, let's be a little bit glib and anecdotal, we refer to the type of network that's like a Bitcoin, or in the way that a virus moves, or let's say peer-to-peer sharing, file sharing networks. We refer to those as gossip networks.
Right. In fact, we have a gossip protocol that is directly used by some of those decentralized currencies.
Exactly. And so it doesn't matter what culture you go to, right? You could go into the jungles of Borneo and they will say, oh yeah, women's gossip. It's a key aspect of disseminating knowledge about current events through the network, through the community. It's women. It's those quote unquote nosy, gossipy women who have the breadth of knowledge about everything going on in the community, and who end up communicating that to the men who are, let's say, in charge of the patriarchy as well. This is just something that has evolved and emerged. But as I said, and I think that this gets into it, we have assigned that matriarchal role. I think we've given it a benign aspect in our minds as modern Western people. We don't have the archetype as they do in the Hindu sort of tradition of Kali, of the devouring mother, of the mother who can trample the male gods under her feet, who has the heads of men bloody hanging off her as a necklace, who's got multi-arms with weapons and fire. We don't have that archetype. To us, the matriarchy has been suppressed in a way, and thus is benign.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and I think it's probably worth noting that that either of these organizations of society is going to have their pluses and minuses, the things that seem to work well about them or bad about them, and they'll both have their perhaps extreme forms that that look toxic. And what one of the reasons I wanted to get you on, based on some comments that you made, they put together in my head this realization that this might be what we're seeing here is an extreme form, speaking specifically of the lockdowns, of of a maybe devouring, in my mind isn't necessarily the right word, but maybe more smothering kind of mother, the one who wants to lock her kids up in their room and never let them leave to keep them safe, to almost put them back in the womb in a sense, in order to protect them, but to do that in a way that that is smothering, or perhaps in some way you could even say devouring, and ultimately not in the best interests, and certainly infantilizing of her charges. No.
Well, yes, and so let's be clear when we talk about the devouring mother. This is an archetype. This is an ancient archetype, an ancient set of archetypes, and that has been extended. I think in modern times, probably Jung has the best exposition of this, although it's quite esoteric. Jung is quite esoteric. More recently, Jordan Peterson has some excellent layman's breakdowns and discussions of these archetypes. I first encountered them in the work of Joseph Campbell, Hero with a Thousand Faces. In terms of these archetypes, he was also, to a certain degree, drawing on some of Jung's interpretations. But these are quite ancient, and we see them in religious texts. We see them in spiritual texts dating back to the most ancient writings that we have, Sumerian and Egyptian, certainly. The idea is that there is a positive and a negative side, let's say, or a blessed and a corrupt side of either the patriarchy or the matriarchy. In the patriarchy, the blessed side is the wise king. The corrupt side is the tyrant. And we can imagine this, the good king or the tyrant. We see this in stories. And on the female side, the blessed side is the Blessed Mother, the Virgin Mary. In the West is the archetype of the Blessed Mother. And then what is called the devouring mother, or you could call it the tyrannical mother. You could call it the smothering mother. And if you look at Kali, I believe it's Shiva. She's trampling Shiva underfoot. She is smothering Shiva, not letting him up. This is in the depiction of Kali herself, who is supposed to be the depiction of the quote-unquote devouring mother. Again, we don't have in our culture a very good cultural depiction of this, which is one of the reasons why I think we have no immunity to what is happening necessarily. But I think, to your point, the dichotomy of the Blessed Mother is very important. And I think that looking at the ideal of Mary as literally the Blessed Mother, as she's called in the Catholic and Orthodox faiths, the hallmark of Mary is that she gave birth to this child, knowing that he was, I guess, sort of special. But most importantly, she let him go. She stood under the cross as he was being persecuted. She cried. She was heartbroken about it, but she let him go toward what he believed to be his fate. And she let him accomplish and become what he was going to become, even such that she had to witness the most terrible thing a mother would ever have to witness, the torture and execution of her beloved son who had done nothing wrong, certainly in her eyes, right? So that is to give us the vision of the Blessed Mother. But again, we don't have the vision archetypally in the West of the devouring mother, and I believe that is part of the reason why we're going through what we're going through today.
So if that's correct, if this is, a reasonable lens through which to view our current moment, and we are indeed moving towards more of a matriarchal society, and there might be a move towards that devouring mother, what do you think that looks like? Do you see that in the lockdowns, and what do you think we're in store for as that archetype rises and as our society becomes organized around those principles?
Well, I think that the first thing to recognize is the nature of the threat that has brought about the devouring mother. I think it's no coincidence that it's a virus. So it is a threat which itself travels in a network-based manner. And so the response has been one that is geared toward mitigating a threat that is moving in a network-based manner. So I think that that's the first very important thing, that it is a matriarchal threat through and through. the virus is moving in a matriarchal mode. For instance, 9/11, that was a patriarchal threat. There was a guy, Osama bin Laden, or Saddam Hussein, or whoever you want it to be, that is at the top of this hierarchy. You remember that when they went into Iraq, they distributed a deck of cards out to the troops. And so you saw that there was a hierarchy. That I believe it was the king of spades was Saddam Hussein. And so then it went down in terms of who was the highest in the hierarchy down through. Now, this particular response, one of the things that we see is that the hierarchy of the state has been at all levels absolutely inept in being able to even ascertain the level of threat. Even to ascertain the level of threat, the models have all been wrong. They've all ended up not following through. The practices that have been assigned, from, oh, everything needs to be locked down, to literally just yesterday, the WHO says, oh, actually, Sweden not locking down is kind of a model for everybody. So it's like there has been a complete and utter inability to do anything about this. It has seemed like the only response has been the response of stay home, don't go out. If you think about all of the things that the devouring mother from a psychological standpoint, and this is where Jung and certainly Peterson definitely come in, is how does a mother destroy or abuse a child? It's very different than the way that a father in the patriarchy abuses a child. A father would be actively putting down the child, or physical abuse, heavy psychological abuse that was an attack against them, kicking them out, neglecting them, but particularly physical abuse. Whereas while that does happen on the female side, what psychologists say much more is that it is an overprotection, as you mentioned, of a child, which basically neuters them and renders them ineffective in the world. And this has been very much, I think, represented by the quote-unquote basement dweller, the millennial who never leaves home, who never has to work, who's taken care of, and who then becomes completely reliant on the parent. And this is actually from mother to son, from a psychological standpoint, this is really viewed as almost a form of psychological incest by a lot of people who analyze this, that it is the mother having a sort of a love affair with the son and not wanting to let him go and become a man, not wanting to be the blessed mother and have to deal with, oh, he's leaving the nest. And it's particularly for men, but we see all of that in the lockdown. The idea that don't leave home, don't go to work, I'll give you an allowance, right? Just stay home. And if you notice what the narrative, and this is a very important pattern, what is the narrative? Because if you don't do this, you will kill me. The older generation. You will kill the older people. It's not going to hurt you at all, but you will kill me. And this is a narrative that devouring, unhealthy mother that you will hear, oh, you're doing this, you're killing me. You're killing me with your behavior. You don't know how much this hurts me. You're a long-suffering mother. And so I think that it's just like it all locks into place in terms of the patterns and the energy about it to say, yes, we are dealing with the devouring mother.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And the comment about it being almost incestuous reminds me that one of the first books that popped in my head when the lockdowns began was Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrews, which is a tale about a mother who locks her kids up in a room in a mansion to protect them in theory, and then the lockdown just drags on. And the book itself has some strong elements of, themes of incestuousness, both between siblings who are locked up in the attic room, and then also the hint of it between the mother and one of her sons in the book. And that seems to be, to me anyway, in my mind, that's one of the weird themes that has come out of this. And it certainly is troubling.
Yeah, it's not incest, but let's say that the sexual energy becomes unproductive. Let's put it like that. I think that pattern is quite interesting and it's quite stark in what is happening right now. There are some who might say that the people involved at a high level of this, the faces that we see, people like Bill Gates, there are conspiracy tinfoil hat people who would say, and now I think that they're getting a little more evidence as they move forward, that Bill Gates is part of a group of people who have a depopulation agenda, right? We've heard this. This is not like something new. I'm not saying that I necessarily ascribe to that, but I think that one of the most interesting things about this is that the first, let's say, establishments that were shut down in this, restaurants, bars, nightclubs, and the idea of social distancing. If you had a depopulation agenda, if you did not want people to meet each other, young breeding age males and females to meet one another and get into relationships and have children, this would fit all of those things that you would basically do exactly this. I mean, even if you're using Tinder or whatever, the governor of Michigan says you can't go to other people's houses. You can't go to a bar. You can't go sit down for coffee. It's only takeout, right? You have to do social distancing. How are you going to go on a date where you have to stay 6 feet apart from one another? And so that then the sexual energy gets taken out in terms of what? Porn? OnlyFans? All of these become the outlets, but really what is it? That sexual energy remains unproductive. It remains inside of your home.
Right. It's stifled in the home. And you're supposed to hole up with your family and that's it. And if you haven't yet found a partner, then you're pretty much out of luck if you were following all of the guidelines.
I mean, there you have it. There is your pattern. And I think that Flowers in the Attic is I guess it's a series of books. It's an incredibly disturbing book, especially considering that it's usually read most of the time by like teenagers. And I think I ran across it when I was maybe 13 or 14, and it's so disturbing. I mean, it's definitely not for youngsters, but man, does it not have so many of the patterns of this entire lockdown debacle right embedded in it. So I think that that's a good call. And if it came to your mind, then that means it's clicking off and resonating with the pattern. And I think that that is spot on of the pattern.
So I think that we've kind of established what it might look like, and what it looks like is a lot like the reaction right now. What do you see, though, as the possible kind of next moves or next steps in the evolution of the kind of the rise of the smothering or devouring mother?
Well, I think that we are going to see a massive change in politics. And that is one of the things that has already happened in the last, let's say, 3 months, where we have the state really being reactive to culture in a way that it hasn't before. We're seeing tyranny, but it really is a tyranny of culture. With there no longer being really a leadership per se, it is, I think, we can draw a direct line from Me Too to the reactions of governors, presidents, prime ministers, so many of them who came out from Trump to Governor Cuomo of New York to Boris Johnson in the UK, who their initial response was not to panic. Their initial response was to say, hold on. Well, this might be, even Trump said, it's probably going to be about as deadly as the flu. And come to find out, it's actually turning out in the US to be about as deadly as the flu. I mean, perhaps a little bit more. But that was kind of a correct statement. And then, this interesting reaction from the public, that is this very wild and vocal fear reaction. And there has been a feedback loop within that of fear reaction, and then politicians trying to acquiesce to the public, giving, let's say, worst case scenarios, those worst case scenarios feeding back into the fear exacerbating. And actually, as the reality and the real data comes out, the public doesn't want to hear that because it's cognitive dissonance for many people. It doesn't fit the narrative. It doesn't fit this, okay, then why did we do all of this? It's kind of this sunk cost fallacy, right? Like, it can't be just like the flu, because look at everything that's been done worldwide. Look at how people have reacted. It can't be just as deadly as the flu. And so I think that what we're going to see more of the reactions with the virus. We're going to see now contact tracing, which is really a tracking that's using this network-based thing. There was just something that came out yesterday as we're talking here, that both the new Google Play services on Android and the new version of iOS, I believe it's 13.5, is going to include COVID-19 contact tracing via Bluetooth that's going to communicate between the phones themselves and basically trace everyone in the world who's got an Android and an iPhone. This is just this is not like conspiracy theory. This is in like 9 to 5 Mac, where they're talking about, hey, we just got the new beta testing of 13.5 iOS, and here's how you can turn off the COVID-19 tracing if you want to. And Apple and Google had talked about this. I think that we are going to see a lot more quote-unquote threats. That's one of the things about the Devouring Mother. She never runs out of threats. She's protecting from every threat. That's the point of the Devouring Mother. She's keeping you safe and in a bubble from every possible threat. She anticipates them, and I think that that's the next step. So in this step, we actually saw a virus that was killing some people. There were certainly actions taken after the fact, although there were actions taken in anticipation of the surge, or whatever you want to call it. This is going to get worse. We're 10 days away from Italy. A lot of draconian actions were taken in anticipation of something that never happened. But I think now the next step for her, as she comes into full fruition, is going to be anticipating things that have not yet occurred, that could occur, but 99.9% of them never do occur. So I think that maybe what we see on the quote-unquote next wave is that the lockdowns happen, the tracing happens, all of this behavior happens in anticipation of the next wave of coronavirus, and there's a very good chance that the virus never actually even hits.
That's really interesting to me. And in particular, it's been both interesting and frightening to watch how panic and really hysteria seem to generate their own momentum. I think most of us understand that once government sets down a path, it creates its own momentum and becomes self-justifying and self-perpetuating, and government policies very rarely fade quickly. They tend to stick around. But just the extent to which that kind of panic and hysteria drives itself forward, and it becomes almost impossible to have any kind of a discussion about that. I remember it wasn't that long ago when someone on CNN mentioned that, that going outside was a homicidal act. And this was the mindset. And then, if you start from that kind of peak of threat level, then it becomes very hard to imagine how one unwinds that and comes back down to a place where you can rationally discuss, well, what's a reasonable response to this?
Well, now I think you're getting into the nuts and bolts of what's next. I myself have left the continental United States. I went to a place that although they did lock themselves down, the behavior of the people here has been quite reasonable. While people are taking precautions, they're not going above and beyond. There's not draconian police actions. The government is trying to certainly cover its butt, but has not been far overreaching in terms of not letting people go over to other people's houses and interact with each other on beaches or wherever. So I think that that's going to be an important choice that people are going to have to make. And I've been urging people to get out of denial of the state that we are in, and to accept that we're not going back to normal. The new normal is something very, very different. Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And the worst is, I think it's appropriate to say, it's unimaginable, because we just have not had we don't have any analog to draw upon historically. This is a global phenomenon. It's a cultural phenomenon. Culture is definitely leading politics in this regard. And it does appear to me that the resistance, or the revolution, but the resistance to this is also quite different. And I think that the resistance to this is in many ways about becoming self-sufficient. If there is resistance to the devouring mother, it is very different than the resistance to the tyrant. The resistance to the tyrant, the father who's beating you, is to fight back in many ways, to punch him in the face, right? That's the moment. So many victims of abuse from their father, especially men, have said that that was the moment when it all ended, was when I was big enough, my father tried something, and I knocked him out. And that's been the response that we have sort of had when we envision resistance. However, the resistance to the devouring mother is not that. The resistance to the devouring mother is to say, I choose to not live in your basement. I choose to not take allowance from you. I choose to be self-sufficient. She's going to rage about that, and she's going to be upset about that. It may require some clandestine action to prepare the way for that, which is very much the story that V.C. Andrews is telling in Flowers in the Attic of their escape. So, that initial action and resistance begins in a clandestine way, a clandestine means of gaining self-sufficiency. And I think that in fairy tales we may see some of this, right? The witch who captures Rapunzel and keeps her in the tower, or in so many of these fairy tales we see that, or Hansel and Gretel as well, that it's this clandestine preparing of resources so that you can escape. Whether it's stockpiling of, little scraps of sheets so that you can tie them together into a rope, or whatever it is, collecting pins so that you could do X, Y, Z. I think that is the resistance. So it's in planting a garden, developing some skills to be able to, work with cryptocurrencies or cryptography, being able to generate your own electricity. Some of these things are going to become illegal. But it still is embracing those ideas of self-sufficiency, embracing a community that is also working in that regard, and working outside of the framework and the cage, the gilded cage that the devouring mother is now building and putting people inside of.
So I like that story a lot, and I like the idea that one might be able to find freedom through self-sufficiency or doing things on the sly or black market or whatever it is. At the same time, though, it's hard for me to imagine that unless you had a critical mass of people in one place who were able to strongly negotiate for hard freedoms, that those kinds of movements wouldn't be quashed and smothered themselves. So, you grow a garden, and that's great, and you get some self-sufficiency there, but the state hasn't gone away. They can always come around and say that your garden has now been collectivized, right? So, I like that idea that might be a mode of resistance, but I guess I'd need to be convinced that that's going to be a workable strategy and not just something that gets rolled over by by the state.
I love your critique of that, and I love that you started with it's hard for me to imagine. And I think that that's actually the key. The reason why it's hard for you to imagine that is because there is no historical analog in the West. Because for 10,000 years we have been resisting a patriarchal state. And to resist the patriarchy, which is a hierarchical being, you need to organize to resist that patriarchy into a hierarchy. So thus comes your organized resistance, your critical mass. But again, that is centralized and specialized. So you have the founding fathers, and you have the guys who are planters, and you have the guys who are philosophers, and you have the guys who are printers, and all of those things together. The guy who runs the shipping company, and the guy who is a general, and all of those things together give you this organization to launch a revolution. But the revolution against the devouring mother is, again, decentralized and generalized. And what a critical mass looks like in that case is very different than a critical mass petitioning the government for something. It is a critical mass that is basically operating outside of the government. Probably the prime example of this would be Samizdat in the USSR, that It was the knowledge in the black market of books and goods, samizdat, which was carried through in a very clandestine way that over time spread culture in a network manner. And over generations, let's say the will of the people to continue to participate had greatly eroded because people had been able to read the Gulag Archipelago. People had been able to see, the counter narrative and the counter ideas, but there wasn't a petitioning. How it ends up happening, how the overthrow or the revolution, how the move for freedom takes place, is literally all at once. In the same way that a virus becomes a problem, is literally overnight, even though it's been propagating throughout. And this was the whole idea of flattening the curve, which again, when you look at those graphs of the curve, what do you see? You see a pyramid, right? Flatten the curve. This is all about a flattening. It's all about all of these patterns, man. Like it's when you see it come back over and over and over again, it tells you that something's going on. This is the energy. Again, it's a pattern that we see. And it's a pattern of our consciousness because all of this is a pattern of our consciousness. And how we behave is built into us. I mean, this is the Jungian idea. And so I know that it's, to get back, I know that it is hard to imagine that the resistance will come in a different way. But what I can promise you is that everyone who approaches resistance in the old way will have their hierarchy flattened. It will be absolutely flattened because the devouring mother steps on that. She has no problem destroying that in the same way that this virus has destroyed the governments all over the world, the most powerful governments in the world. It has laid them low, the same way that Me Too did. So you're going to have to approach this in a network way, a virus way. You're going to have to build up the mimetic code within yourself such that you can spread it first. You have to become a super spreader of self-sufficiency. And the critical mass, once it hits a critical mass, it will just simply end. The switch will simply flip in the same way that it does with the virus.
So, yeah, it's certainly an appealing thought that might happen, at least from the perspective of regaining a certain autonomy and getting out from the smothering mother. But just the mention of Russia is, that's a cautionary tale too. There were extraordinary and wonderful ways in which information was passed around, but it was, the Soviet Union took an extraordinary human toll along the way, and it's not clear that they have recovered from that yet. The way in which the trust between other people has been eroded in that culture that continues until now. Are we doomed to a very long Soviet Union-like period at something close to a global scale here, or is there a way to keep things alive and move forward that reawakening without going through a period, like the Soviet Russia or communist China period?
To be honest, it's unfortunate. I hate to have to say this, and I think people listening will think this is pessimistic, but everything inside of me says that when we're talking about consciousness, we only learn when we learn the hard way. And as you say, this has a momentum all its own. As I look around, I do not see, even as the actual data comes out, even as, I think there was this great marker recently of these two doctors, I believe they're in California, who had this video that went completely viral, millions or tens of millions of views, where they were basically saying that, from what we've seen in our actual practice, and it's a long video and it's very detailed, and, these two very experienced MDs saying, we've been dealing with this crisis, this is what we've seen. The response is not helpful. The narrative that's coming from the state and coming from the WHO is just quite frankly wrong. It doesn't reflect the data on the ground. All of this very sober, and YouTube censored it.
Right. And I think that, from very early on here, it seemed to me that the narrative was always about the narrative and it wasn't about the facts on the ground, that this was about pushing in a particular direction, and new information wasn't necessarily going to change that. In fact, it seemed to me from the beginning very unlikely that it would change that, because goalposts can shift, and of course they have been shifted. And we can quickly move from, from flatten the curve to we need testing to we need a vaccine, and never miss a beat and never admit that the original reaction was a mistake. So I very much see that. And then alongside of that, as you say, what has to come is a kind of suppression of any information that would lead one to question the direction that we've moved in, because that is the direction that a large group of people want to move in.
Yes, and so I think taking this pattern of momentum, it wasn't just in Russia that we saw it. If people haven't read at least the first volume or listened to it as an audiobook of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, it is absolutely, you will see so many parallels in terms of the development of how the Soviet state developed into the sort of corrupt state that it did. And a lot of it was about the persecution of individuals who questioned the official narrative. And that those people, the idea that those people were, the term they used, the English translation is wreckers, and that they would persecute these wreckers because these people were saying that, the central planning that's happening is actually having a negative effect. Oh no, if you say that, it doesn't actually matter if it's true. You are actually an enemy of the state. And we are very much seeing that, but we also saw that in the Salem witch trials and other and the other witch panics around the world. We know a lot about the Salem witch trials because Cotton Mather, who is probably the foremost, let's say, academic at the time, and who was trying to justify the witch trials, wrote with his father Increase, who was at the time the head of Harvard University, the Wonders of the Invisible World, which is trying to be a justification for the Salem witch trials after the fact, after most of the people have realized that it was a hysteria, and why did we kill all of our fellow, we killed these people for no reason, these innocent people. This is a pattern that you see, and the fact of the matter is that while you're in that pattern, you cannot emerge. While you have this justification, you cannot emerge. And so, unfortunately, what I see that we are on the upswing of that curve. We have not even begun the censorship. We have just started down the path of identifying the wreckers. Now, the interesting moral of the story in that Gulag Archipelago is that even the main prosecutor, the most zealotous individual who was persecuting the wreckers, eventually finds himself accused of being a wrecker and thrown into the Gulag, which is something that you also see with, at least in Arthur Miller's depiction of the Salem witch trials in The Crucible, was that basically the time when it stopped was when the young girls then decided that they were going to accuse the ministers who had been holding the trials and accuse those ministers' wives, was the time when those ministers said, okay, this is enough.
Yeah, I think that, just to jump in, I think that that's actually a really frightening analogy with the witch trials, and that general idea of an invisible enemy that's all around us and that could be anyone. I can see how the way to get out of that might be to finally kind of turn the torches towards those who are perpetuating it. Though there were some attempts to do that early on in the lockdowns. There were a lot of people pointing out that the governors or mayors or whatever who were putting into effect these lockdown orders were not themselves following it, that there was, a rule for thee and me and not for thee kind of situation. But despite that, the presence of that kind of dual layer hierarchy and the attempt anyway to turn the pitchforks at the ruling class, that it hasn't seemed to have gotten much traction anyway, no?
No, it hasn't. And that's why I say that we are on the upswing of this, because the way that that it is going to come to an end is when you have these things actually gaining traction. Again, culture is a leading indicator of politics. So it's basically how you know that people are sick of it is when you have them turning on the individuals who were doing this and basically attacking them and putting them at some real legal jeopardy, you could say, some real jeopardy with the state for their hypocrisy when they hold them to the same standard. And which you can see that is a natural outcropping of the pattern and of the momentum. It's that in the beginning, people don't take it so seriously, so hypocrisy is not an issue. But those people who are pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, when you inculcate it into the culture, and then you flout the rules, and then the people can see it, they legitimately will attack you for it because the policy and the procedure has superseded the personality. We've not reached that point yet, but it is only, history has shown us that it is only when we reach that point that we can turn the corner. And that's the unfortunate part right now, is that the degree to which we've gone, and to think that we are still on the upswing, to me is absolutely frightening. But it was also a great impetus for me to pick up my family and leave the state of California with quote unquote the clothes on our back and end up on the last flight in. Basically, I was like, wow, this is like mythopoetic. We're almost like a German Jews fleeing Germany, literally on the last flight into the location that we're at before they shut this island down.
Yeah, and I think that's fantastic that you got out, and I think that more broadly we may be looking if there's some kind of a false dawn here at a kind of a collective unleavened bread moment where people do have to do that in mass and go wherever they have to go. But not kind of leave things on so completely a depressing note. I want to point out one of the silver linings that I've seen in this, and maybe something that points to the hope of, say, the torch is turning around in this situation, which is the identification, I guess, of the Karen, and the absolute resistance there's been, and I guess a decentralized resistance against the notion that the right way to go forward is to turn in your fellow man for disobeying social distancing. And I do see certainly a flourishing of that, or maybe a revival of a certain American spirit that is highly hostile to what might broadly be called snitches. Do you see that as well?
Oh, I think that is such a key and important point, because that is very much, again, let's go to the gossip network, right? This is very much going to hinge on the Karens. The Karens are the most important aspect of this whole thing. And I think that, again, you can draw the energy right to the Me Too hashtag. I've seen it very much as a hashtag movement. I'm seeing Karens on Twitter taking pictures and then tagging their governor, their sheriff's department, saying, these people are out, they're at this park, stop them, blah, blah, blah. And it's moving in the same way, right? They're pushing it out in the same manner. I think that is very important, and I said this publicly weeks ago, one of the most valuable things you can be doing right now, if you want this to end, is Karen shaming. To attack back and Karen the Karens, basically. Expose them, especially if you're somebody who has anything approaching a significant social media following. And I've been doing it myself. When I see them, I direct my followers at them, right? I'm like, troll them, go after them, do the same thing to them that they're trying to do to you. That is the way to resist. Because if the state and if this devouring mother is able to effectively incentivize, and the mayor of New York, de Blasio, and some other governors as well have been offering bounties and whatnot for Karening. If you turn somebody in, snitches get riches. That's the sort of idea. See something, say something, but now they're putting a financial incentive.
Which is, I just have to jump in, which is one of the driving forces of the witch hunts that people don't like to consider. There were financial rewards to turning in witches. But anyway, go ahead with what you're saying.
Oh, certainly. And I mean, Arthur Miller deals with that in a big way, the idea of turning in your neighbor so that you could get their land. the farmer who was on the land next to you so that you would be able to snatch up their land. That was a big thing in Soviet Russia too. If those incentives get aligned more so than they are today, it's going to be a very big problem. And especially when we have these clandestine sort of chirping contact tracing things going on our phones, and so you don't know who a Karen is necessarily, and that they're just going to, because if you have a certain number of data points, you become de-anonymized really quickly, right? If someone thinks you're doing something and they're a Karen, and they press a little button on their phone, and so it's picking up all the Bluetooth nearby, and then they follow you to 3 other locations. And then they look at the set of data, and your little identifier is the only one in those 3 other locations, and she's clandestinely taking a picture of you. You're de-anonymized. Or taking a picture of your license plate on your car or whatever. They're like, okay, boom, we know who you are, de-anonymized, here we come, we're coming for you. So Karen shaming is very important right now. It might be the one most important move that people can make if they would like to see this thing turn around and the momentum shift. I don't know if it will be enough, but I would hate to be nihilistic. We've all got to do anything that we can at this moment. Yeah,
and I think we do, and maybe the takeaway is that our only act of resistance right now is Karen shaming, or sending dick pics to the mayors who set up those snitch lines.
Yeah, trolling is decentralized and generalized. It's network-based. 4chan, it's no coincidence, that everybody's an anon, that it's anons on 4chan, which is decentralized and generalized. A flattened hierarchy. There's always the kernel of resistance, and it's funny that, the Blessed Mother may end up being 4chan-like in the end, and things being flipped on their head is, I think, the nature of the time that we're in. It's the nature of matriarchy, the sort of chaos model, chaos versus order, of the order of the patriarchy and the chaos. And, the blessed chaos of the troll may end up at the end being the saving grace of our world. And wouldn't that be amazing?
Wouldn't that be amazing? And no matter how this turns out, and hopefully it does start to turn around soon, this is an incredible timeline that we're living in.
100% agree with that.
I thank you so much for coming on and talking with me. Vin, tell our listeners where they can read more of your stuff.
So, at Vin Armani on Twitter is where I'm posting most of my daily or hourly thoughts. Monthly, I have a newsletter that's called Counter Markets. We've been doing it for years now. It is an agorist newsletter, so we've been focused on counter economics. I think it's particularly poignant at this time. With the subscription to the newsletter, you also get access to our private Telegram group, which has subscribers from all over the world, some very, very interesting, intelligent, and active people who have great solutions to all kinds of problems, and it's been particularly busy during this time. So that's countermarkets.com. And then if people want to read my books, my first book, Tao of the Gigolo, you can get it on Amazon. You can just search for my name on Amazon, Vin Armani, and it'll come up. And my second book, Self-Ownership, The Foundation of Property and Morality, I only sell it for cryptocurrency. You can get it in either signed paperback or in digital form with the ebook and audiobook. But that's only on my website at vinarmani.com/self-ownership, or you can go to selfownership.me to order that.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being part of The Filter.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Thanks for listening to The Filter with Matt Asher. You can find show notes at thefilter.org or follow user Matt Asher on the socials.